For 9 years, Brielle Hale lived in absolute silence. Her father, a Hells Angels vice president, spent everything trying to fix it. Dozens of doctors, thousands of dollars, zero results. Then, a homeless 14-year-old boy with no medical training walked up to her in a park, reached into her ear, and did the impossible. In 30 seconds, she heard sound for the first time in her life. But what that biker did for that homeless boy 60 seconds later, that's the part you never saw coming. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. Daddy. The word hung in the air like a question mark, shaped from hope alone. Brielle's lips formed the sound carefully, deliberately, the way a sculptor might shape clay without ever seeing the final form. Her voice was soft, tentative, reaching out into a world she had never truly experienced. Theron Hale heard it, but Brielle didn't. She couldn't hear anything. Not the rumble of motorcycles outside their small Arizona ranch house. Not the creak of worn leather as her father shifted his weight. Not the gentle scrape of his boots against wooden floors that had seen decades of stories. Not even the sound of her own voice calling out to him. For 9 years, Brielle had lived in absolute silence. A silence so complete, so total, that every word she spoke was nothing more than an educated guess. She remembered the shape of Daddy on her lips because she'd practiced it 1,000 times, watching her father's face light up each time she said it, trusting that she'd gotten it right. But she had never heard it. Not once. Theron stood there in the doorway, the late afternoon sun casting his shadow long across the room. He was watching his 9-year-old daughter try to navigate a world that existed only in silence. His jaw tightened, not from anger, not from frustration, but from a pain so deep, so profound, that it had carved permanent lines into his weathered face. This was a man who'd survived 30 years in the Hells Angels. A man who carried scars from bar fights, highway crashes, and losses that would have broken most people. Theron Ironside Hale wasn't a man easily shaken, but watching his daughter live in silence, that shook him every single day. Brielle tilted her head slightly to the right. Always the right. The way she always did when the discomfort came. Her small fingers reached up, tapping gently against her ear, trying to ease some invisible pressure that had been there for as long as anyone could remember. She winced. Just barely. But Theron caught it. He caught everything. He'd spent tens of thousands of dollars trying to fix this. Audiologists with letters after their names that stretched longer than his rap sheet. Specialists in Tucson, Phoenix, even Los Angeles. Neurologists, ENT doctors with impressive credentials, and even more impressive bills. They'd all taken his money. They'd all run their tests. They'd all offered their theories. Nerve damage, some said. Congenital defect, others suggested. Developmental delay. Structural abnormality. Cochlear malformation. The medical jargon came fast and clinical, but the answers never did. Every appointment ended the same way, with shrugs, apologies, and another referral to yet another specialist who couldn't help. Brielle had learned to read lips by the time she was 4. She'd learned to feel vibrations by pressing her hands against surfaces when people spoke. She'd learned to exist in a world that moved and spoke and sang around her while she remained locked in silence. And she did it with more grace than most adults could manage. But Theron saw the confusion in her eyes when other children laughed at something she couldn't hear. He saw the way she'd place her tiny hand on his chest when he spoke, trying to feel the rumble of his words since she couldn't hear them. He saw her frustration when she tried to hum along to music she'd never experienced, her voice slightly off-key, her timing just a beat behind everyone else's. It wasn't fair. And Theron Hale, a man who'd made peace with most of life's injustices, who'd accepted that the world didn't owe anyone mercy, couldn't make peace with this one. So he did what he rarely allowed himself to do. He took a day off. He pushed aside the club business, the rides, the Brotherhood obligations that usually consumed his time, the collections, the meetings, the weight of being vice president of a chapter that spanned 3 counties. He dressed Brielle in her favorite turquoise sundress, the one that made her feel like she belonged somewhere prettier than a desert biker town. He packed a small bag with snacks and juice boxes, and he decided to take her to the neighborhood park just outside Prescott Valley. Maybe the sunshine would help. Maybe the swings would bring her joy. Maybe for just one afternoon, he could give her a moment of happiness that didn't require hearing. It was a small hope, a modest goal, but what Theron didn't know What he couldn't possibly have known as he buckled Brielle into his truck and headed toward that park was that the answer to 9 years of silence was already there, waiting, sitting on a sun-bleached wooden bench just 20 feet from where they'd soon stand. And it wasn't a doctor. It wasn't a specialist with decades of training or access to expensive medical equipment. It was a 14-year-old homeless kid who'd learned to survive by noticing what everyone else missed. If you've ever watched someone you love struggle with something you can't fix, hit that subscribe button. Because what happens next proves that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. And if you believe in miracles, stick with me. The first doctor's appointment happened when Brielle was 11 months old. Theron had noticed it early. The way she didn't turn toward his voice, didn't startle at loud noises, didn't respond to the world of sound that surrounded her. The pediatrician was reassuring. Give it time, she'd said. Some babies develop slower than others. So Theron gave it time. 7 months later, when Brielle still hadn't responded to a single sound, he took her to a specialist. Then another. Then another. The waiting rooms all looked the same. Sterile, cold, filled with outdated magazines and the quiet desperation of parents seeking answers. Theron sat in those chairs dozens of times. Brielle on his lap, her small body nestled against his leather vest, completely unaware of the conversations happening around her. The tests were exhaustive. Audiometry exams, tympanometry, auditory brainstem response testing, CT scans, MRI imaging, each one more expensive than the last, each one promising clarity that never came. Mr. Hale, the auditory nerve appears intact. Mr. Hale, there's no structural damage we can identify. Mr. Hale, this is quite unusual. We're not seeing the typical markers of congenital deafness. The medical terminology became a language Theron learned to hate. Words like idiopathic and unexplained etiology and we'll need to run more tests became the soundtrack to his frustration. They weren't answers. They were expensive ways of saying we don't know. Theron paid every bill without hesitation. Money wasn't the issue. He'd liquidate every asset he had if it meant giving Brielle her hearing. But the problem was that no amount of money seemed to matter. One specialist suggested hearing aids. They fitted Brielle with tiny devices that amplified sound she still couldn't process. She wore them for 4 months before the doctor admitted they weren't helping. Another recommended cochlear implants. Theron researched them obsessively, stayed up nights reading medical journals and parent testimonials, prepared himself for the surgery. But when they did the pre-surgical evaluation, the surgeon shook his head. Her case doesn't fit the typical profile. I'm not confident implants would be effective. More money, more tests, more appointments that ended with sympathetic looks and no solutions. What made it worse, what made Theron's jaw clench and his hands ball into fists during those appointments, was that Brielle clearly felt something. She'd tilt her head to the right, always the right, and tap at her ear with those tiny fingers. Sometimes she'd wince. Sometimes she'd rub at it absently, like there was pressure building inside that she couldn't explain. Theron mentioned it every single time. Doctor, she keeps touching her right ear. Could there be something there? Some kind of blockage? They'd look. They'd shine their lights and peer through their instruments and examine her ear canal with tools that cost more than most people's cars. Everything appears clear, Mr. Hale. The canal looks normal. There's no obstruction we can detect. But the ache remained. And Brielle kept tilting her head, kept tapping, kept trying to ease a discomfort that every trained medical professional assured Theron didn't exist. By the time Brielle turned 9, Theron had seen 23 different specialists. He'd spent over $60,000 on appointments, tests, scans, and consultations. He'd traveled to 3 different states, chasing recommendations and second opinions from doctors who claimed to be the best in their field. Every single one of them looked at Brielle's ear. Every single one of them missed what mattered. The park on West Hillside wasn't much. A few swings with rusted chains. A slide that had seen better decades. Patchy grass that turned brown every summer and barely recovered by fall. But it was quiet. And on that particular Tuesday afternoon in late September, it was exactly what Theron needed. He pulled his truck into the gravel lot, killed the engine, and looked over at Brielle in the passenger seat. She was already unbuckling herself, her eyes bright with excitement at the prospect of an afternoon outside. Theron managed a small smile. This was all he wanted. Just one good day. One afternoon where his daughter could feel joy without the weight of her silence pressing down on both of them. Brielle ran ahead toward the swings, her turquoise dress catching the sunlight, her small feet kicking up dust as she moved. Theron followed at a slower pace, his boots heavy on the ground, his mind still turning over the latest failed doctor's appointment from 4 days earlier. He was tired, not physically, but tired in the way that comes from years of trying and failing. Tired of hope that led nowhere. Tired of watching specialists shake their heads and offer nothing but more referrals. Tired of the weight sitting on his chest every morning when he woke up knowing his daughter would spend another day locked in silence. 20 feet away, sitting on a worn wooden bench near the basketball court, Cashin watched them arrive. He'd been there for about an hour. His usual spot when he needed somewhere to rest during the day. The park was safe. Families came and went. Nobody paid attention to a quiet kid on a bench. As long as he didn't cause trouble, didn't approach anyone, didn't draw attention, he could sit there for hours without anyone asking questions. Cashin had learned to occupy himself by observing. Watching people became both entertainment and education. He'd study how families interacted, how parents responded to their children, how people moved through the world with the casual confidence that came from having a home to return to. He noticed everything. So when Brielle walked past him toward the swings, Cashin noticed immediately the way her head tilted slightly to the right. The casual, almost unconscious movement of her hand reaching up to tap at her ear. The exact angle of discomfort he'd seen before. Cashin sat up straighter. Brielle climbed onto the swing, her father pushing her gently from behind. She smiled, but every few seconds, her hand would drift back to her right ear. The tapping, the gentle pressure she applied with her fingertips, trying to ease something nobody else seemed to notice. Cashin's eyes narrowed. He leaned forward on the bench, watching more carefully now. The sunlight hit Brielle's face at just the right angle as she turned her head. And that's when Cashin saw it. Deep inside her ear canal, barely visible, but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. A dark mass, compacted, lodged firmly. The kind of blockage that wouldn't come out on its own. The kind that could cause pressure, discomfort, and if it was positioned just right against the eardrum, complete hearing loss. Cashin's breath caught in his throat. He knew exactly what that was. He'd seen it before. He'd removed one before. And suddenly, with a clarity that sent electricity through his entire body, he understood. This little girl wasn't just uncomfortable. She was deaf because of that blockage. And nobody, not her father, not the doctors, not anyone, had seen it. Cashin's heart started pounding. His hands gripped the edge of the wooden bench until his knuckles turned white. He could help her. He knew he could. It would take 30 seconds. Maybe less. One careful extraction, and that little girl could hear for the first time in who knows how long. But Cashin also knew what would happen if he approached her. He'd spent 3 years learning to be invisible precisely because approaching people, especially children, when you looked like he did was dangerous. The father was right there. A big man. Intimidating. Leather vest with patches that Cashin recognized. Hell's Angels. The red and white colors. The Death Head logo. The bottom rocker that read Arizona. This wasn't just any father. This was someone who wouldn't hesitate to protect his daughter from a strange barefoot kid with scraped knees and unwashed clothes. If Cashin approached her, the man might grab him. Might hurt him. Might call the police. And then what? Foster care. Questions he couldn't answer. The end of his freedom. But if he didn't approach her, that little girl would stay deaf forever. When the solution was right there. When he could fix it in seconds. Cashin's heart started racing. He knew exactly what was wrong. But he also knew what would happen if he approached a biker's daughter uninvited. He had seconds to decide. Stay safe and invisible. Or risk everything to help. Tom's decision came in the space between heartbeats. One moment he was frozen on that bench, paralyzed by fear and self-preservation. The next, his body was moving before his mind could talk him out of it. He jumped up, his bare feet hitting the dusty ground with purpose. Brielle had stepped off the swing and was wandering toward the slide, her hands still drifting to her ear every few seconds. She was maybe 15 feet away from Cashin now, moving in that casual, aimless way children do when they're exploring their surroundings. Cashin started walking toward her. His heart hammered so violently in his chest he thought it might crack his ribs. Every survival instinct he had honed over 3 years of living on the streets screamed at him to stop, to sit back down, to stay invisible. But he kept walking. Brielle turned slightly, noticing the boy approaching. She tilted her head, curious but not afraid. She couldn't hear his footsteps, couldn't hear the urgency in his breathing. She just saw another kid, barefoot and skinny, moving toward her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Theron saw too. The reaction was immediate and primal. Theron's body shifted between Cassian and Brielle before conscious thought even registered. His hand came up, palm out, a barrier of flesh and authority. "Hey!" Theron's voice cut through the afternoon air like a blade. "Back up." Cassian stopped immediately, his hands raised slightly, showing he meant no harm. But he didn't back away. His eyes were locked on Brielle, specifically on her right ear, and the urgency in his face was unmistakable. "I'm sorry," Cassian said quickly, his voice higher than he wanted it to be, cracking slightly with nervousness. "I'm sorry, but please. Back up, kid." Theron's tone left no room for negotiation. He was a full foot taller than Cassian, broader, harder, a man who'd spent decades making people listen when he spoke. But Cassian shook his head, the movement quick and desperate. "Please," he repeated, and this time there was something in his voice that made Theron hesitate. Not fear, not manipulation, just raw, genuine concern. "Something's in her ear. I can see it. I think I can help." Theron's jaw tightened. This was Arizona. Homeless kids approached people all the time with stories, with angles, with reasons why you should give them money or attention or trust. Theron had heard them all. He'd developed a thick skin against sob stories and manipulation. But this kid wasn't asking for money, wasn't even looking at Theron. His entire focus was on Brielle, and the expression on his face was one Theron recognized, because he'd seen it in the mirror for 9 years. Desperation to help someone who was suffering. Theron's hand shot out and grabbed Cassian's wrist. Not violently, but firmly. A warning and a restraint all at once. "You've got 5 seconds to explain yourself," Theron said quietly. The kind of quiet that was more threatening than shouting. Cassian looked up at him. Those sharp eyes. Eyes that had seen too much for a 14-year-old. Meeting Theron's without flinching. "There's something stuck in her ear," Cassian said, speaking fast but clearly. "A blockage deep in the canal. I can see it from here when the light hits right. It's been there a long time. That's why she keeps touching it. That's why she tilts her head. I've helped with this before. I know what to do. Please, just let me try. If you're holding your breath right now, you're not alone. Hit that like button if you want to see this boy prove everyone wrong." Theron stared at him. His grip on Cassian's wrist didn't loosen, but something shifted in his expression. Doubt maybe, or desperate hope wearing the disguise of skepticism. Brielle stood there between them, unaware of the tension, her hand once again drifting to her ear. Theron made his decision. He didn't release Cassian's wrist. Not yet, but he stepped aside just enough to give the boy a narrow path to his daughter. What happened in the next 10 seconds would either end in a homeless boy getting hurt, or a miracle no one saw coming. Cassian moved slowly, deliberately, every motion telegraphed and careful, as if approaching a frightened animal. Brielle watched him with curious eyes, her head tilted in that familiar way, completely unaware that the next 30 seconds would change her entire world. "I need to look in her ear," Cassian said softly, more to Theron than to Brielle. "I won't hurt her. I promise." Theron's grip on Cassian's wrist tightened for just a moment. A final warning, a final hesitation, and then loosened slightly. Not a release, just enough slack for Cassian to move. Cassian knelt down, bringing himself to Brielle's eye level. He smiled at her, trying to look reassuring despite his nervousness. Brielle smiled back, innocent and trusting in the way only children can be. "Hi," Cassian whispered, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "This might feel weird for a second, but I'm going to help you. Okay?" Brielle's eyes searched his face, reading his expression the way she'd learned to read the world. Through sight alone, through the shape of mouths and the softness of eyes. Cassian leaned in closer. His right hand came up, fingers extended, approaching Brielle's right ear with the kind of precision that seemed impossible for a 14-year-old boy. But Cassian had learned precision from necessity. When you survive by helping others, you learn to be gentle, to be careful, to do no harm. Theron stood over them both, his body coiled tight as a spring, his hand still wrapped around Cassian's wrist. One wrong move, one indication that this kid meant harm, one cry fro. One of the older bikers, a man called Garrett, whose road name was Iron Jaw, stepped forward. His face was a road map of scars and sun damage, his eyes sharp beneath heavy brows. He looked Cassian up and down, taking in the bare feet, the dirty clothes, the fear barely hidden behind defensive eyes. "How old are you, kid?" Garrett asked, his voice gravelly from decades of cigarettes and shouting over engine noise. 14, Cashin answered quietly, his voice almost disappearing into the ambient sounds of the room. Garrett nodded slowly. Then he looked at Theron. "He got people? Family somewhere?" "No," Theron said simply. "He's been surviving on his own for 3 years." Something shifted in the room. The atmosphere changed in a way that was almost tangible. These men who rarely trusted outsiders, who'd been rejected by society themselves, who'd built their own family precisely because the world had pushed them out. They didn't see Cashin as charity. They saw themselves in him. Every single one of them had a story. An absent father, an abusive home, a system that failed them, a world that decided they were worthless before they were old enough to prove otherwise. They'd all been Cashin at some point. Alone, struggling, surviving on instinct and desperation. Vance, the president, spoke next. He was older than Theron, but carried the same authority, the same presence that came from earning respect rather than demanding it. "Vice president's making him family," Vance said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Anyone got a problem with that?" Silence. Then Garrett stepped forward again, this time approaching Cashin directly. The boy tensed, every muscle in his body preparing to run, even though he had nowhere to go. Garrett extended his hand. "Welcome home, kid," he said simply. Cashin stared at the offered hand for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this was real or some elaborate setup for disappointment. Then slowly he reached out and shook it. His small hand disappeared completely inside Garrett's calloused grip. One by one, the other bikers stepped forward. Each one shook Cashin's hand. Each one welcomed him, not with pity, not with condescension, but with the same respect they'd show any prospect joining their ranks. "We'll set him up in the back room," someone said. "Kid needs clothes," another added. "I've got nephews about his size. I'll bring some things tomorrow." "School," a third voice chimed in. "He'll need to get enrolled. My wife works at the district office. She can help with that." The logistics came fast, each brother offering something practical, something concrete. This wasn't empty charity. This wasn't a feel-good gesture that would fade when the emotion wore off. This was a brotherhood absorbing a new member, making space in their lives for someone who needed them. Theron watched it happen with something close to awe. He'd expected support. His brothers always had his back. But this was different. This was unanimous, instant, and absolute. Cashin wasn't being tolerated. He was being claimed. By the end of the evening, Cashin had a room at the clubhouse. Not a cot in a corner, but an actual room with a door that locked. A bed with clean sheets. A dresser that would soon be filled with clothes that actually fit. He had a meal in his stomach. A real meal. Hot food that someone had cooked specifically for him. He had people asking him questions about what he liked, what he needed, what he wanted to be when he grew up. Questions nobody had asked him in 3 years. But what Cashin didn't know yet, what none of them knew yet, was that claiming him as family would put every single one of them in danger. Because 60 miles away, in a rival clubhouse, someone had been watching, and they didn't like what they saw. 3 weeks had passed since Cashin moved into the clubhouse. 3 weeks of learning what it meant to belong somewhere. To have people who expected him home for dinner, who asked about his day, who helped him with homework at the kitchen table, who woke him up in the mornings and made sure he had clean clothes and a packed lunch. 3 weeks of being someone who mattered. Brielle visited almost every day, her father bringing her by after school. She'd run straight to Cashin, wrapping her arms around him, and tell him about every sound she'd discovered that day. The rain on the roof, the school bell, her teacher's voice. Music. Always music. She couldn't get enough of music. Cashin had started school, 8th grade at Valley View Middle. It was strange at first, sitting in classrooms with kids his age who'd never missed a day, who had parents who picked them up in clean cars, who complained about things that seemed impossibly small to someone who'd slept in alleys. But Garrett's wife had helped with enrollment, had forged the necessary documents that said Cashin was Theron's nephew from out of state, had smiled kindly when she did it, and told Cashin that sometimes the rules needed bending for the right reasons. The teachers liked him. He was quiet, polite. His grades were surprisingly good for someone who'd missed 3 years of formal education. He absorbed information like a sponge, as if making up for lost time. The brothers treated him like he'd always been there. They taught him how to change motorcycle oil, how to rebuild an engine, how to throw a proper punch if he ever needed to defend himself. They included him in church meetings, the mandatory gatherings where chapter business was discussed. He didn't have voting privileges, wouldn't until he was old enough and had proven himself over time. But they wanted him to learn, to understand how the Brotherhood operated, to see that family wasn't just about blood. It was about loyalty, about showing up, about protecting each other no matter what. But not everyone was happy about Cashin's presence. 60 miles south in Phoenix, in a rundown warehouse that served as the clubhouse for the Scorpions MC, a rival motorcycle club, 3 men sat around a table covered in empty beer bottles and cigarette ash. The Scorpions had been at odds with the Hells Angels for years. Territory disputes, old grudges, the kind of animosity that built up over decades and never quite went away. And when word reached them that the Hells Angels had taken in some homeless kid, that Brielle Hale had given the boy his own cut in a public park, they saw an opportunity. The leader of the Scorpions' Phoenix chapter was a man named Dwayne. Hard eyes, harder reputation. He'd spent 15 years building his club's presence in Arizona, and he didn't appreciate the Hells Angels expanding their influence. Didn't appreciate them getting good press for taking in some stray kid like they were heroes instead of outlaws. So Dwayne made a call to someone inside the Hells Angels, someone who'd been feeding him information for months in exchange for cash. A patch member named Riker who'd gotten himself deep in gambling debt and needed money fast. Riker had been with the Hells Angels for 7 years, long enough to be trusted, to be included in private conversations, to know schedules and movements and where people would be on any given day. He'd never wanted to betray his brothers. But desperation makes people do things they never thought they would. And when Dwayne offered him $5,000 for information about the kid, Riker took it. He told himself it was harmless. Just information. Nothing would actually happen. He was wrong. The call came on a Thursday evening. Cashin was at the clubhouse, doing homework at the kitchen table. Theron was out on a run with half the chapter. A regular ride down to Tucson and back. Nothing unusual. Garrett was there. And Vance. And 3 other brothers. Enough to keep the clubhouse secure. Or so they thought. Riker had told Dwayne exactly when Theron would be gone. Exactly how many men would be left behind. Exactly where Cashin would be. If you believe loyalty should never be sold, comment betrayal has no place in Brotherhood. Let's stand with those who keep their word. The Scorpions arrived just after sunset. 6 bikes. 12 men. They didn't come in loud. Didn't announce themselves. They pulled up quietly, killed their engines a block away, and approached the clubhouse on foot. Cashin heard them before anyone else did. 3 years of survival had taught him to notice things. The scrape of boots on gravel. The whisper of voices trying to stay quiet. He looked up from his math homework, his body tensing. Something was wrong. He could feel it. Garrett, he said quietly. The older biker looked up from the newspaper he'd been reading. What's up, kid? Someone's outside, Cashin whispered. Multiple people. Garrett's expression changed instantly, from relaxed to alert in a heartbeat. He stood, moving toward the window, his hand already reaching for the knife he kept clipped to his belt. Vance noticed the movement and stood too. How many? Garrett asked. Cashin closed his eyes, listening. A lot, he said. Maybe 10. Maybe more. Vance swore under his breath. He pulled his phone, calling Theron. It rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. They were probably still riding, out of cell range in the mountains between Prescott and Tucson. The first rock came through the window 30 seconds later. Glass exploded inward, shards scattering across the floor. Then voices shouting from outside. Hells Angels. Come out and talk. We got business to discuss. Garrett recognized the voice. Dwayne. The Scorpions. This wasn't a social call. Lock the doors, Vance ordered. Get the kid to the back room. Now. One of the brothers, a younger patch member named Cole, grabbed Cashin by the shoulder and started pulling him toward the hallway. But Cashin resisted. This is because of me, he said, his voice shaking but certain. They're here because of me. Cole didn't answer, just kept pulling. They got Cashin into the back room, the same room he'd been sleeping in for 3 weeks. The same room that had started to feel like home. Stay here, Cole said firmly. Don't come out no matter what you hear. You understand? Cashin nodded, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. Cole shut the door, and Cashin heard the lock click from outside. He was trapped. Protected, maybe, but trapped. Outside, Dwayne's voice came again. We know you got the kid in there. The homeless one. The miracle worker. Send him out. We just want to talk. Like hell they did. Garrett knew exactly what this was. Intimidation. A message. The Scorpions wanted to prove that the Hells Angels weren't untouchable. That taking in some random kid made them weak. Made them vulnerable. And if they could get to Cashin, they could hurt the chapter in a way that had nothing to do with territory or money and everything to do with reputation and pride. Vance stepped outside. Alone. Unarmed, at least visibly. His hands raised slightly to show he wasn't looking for a fight. "What do you want, Dwayne?" Vance asked. His voice steady. Calm. The kind of calm that came from years of dealing with situations exactly like this. Dwayne smiled. The kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Told you. We want the kid. You all playing house with some stray, acting like you're charity workers instead of bikers. It's embarrassing. Hand him over. We'll take him off your hands." "Not happening," Vance said simply. Dwayne's smile faded. "Then we got a problem." Vance didn't move. Didn't flinch. "You leave now. This ends here. You push this, Theron's gonna hear about it. And you know what that means." Dwayne took a step forward. "Theron ain't here. And from what I hear, half your chapter's out riding. That leaves what, 5 of you? Against 12 of us. Do the math, old man." Inside, Cashin was listening to every word through the thin walls. His hands were shaking. His breathing coming fast and shallow. This was his fault. These men were here because Theron had taken him in. Because the Brotherhood had claimed him. And now they were in danger because of him. He looked around the room. At the bed with clean sheets. At the dresser filled with clothes that actually fit. At the pictures on the wall that Brielle had drawn for him. At the homework still spread across the small desk. This was his home. These people were his family. And he wasn't going to let them get hurt because of him. Cashin made a decision. The same kind of decision he'd made 3 weeks ago in the park. The kind that bypassed fear and went straight to what was right. He unlocked the window, pushed it open, and climbed out into the desert night. Cashin dropped from the window into the dirt behind the clubhouse. His feet hit the ground harder than he expected, sending a jolt through his ankles, but he didn't stop moving. He circled around the building, staying in the shadows, moving toward the front where the confrontation was happening. His heart was hammering. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to disappear into the night the way he'd disappeared 1,000 times before. But he couldn't. Not this time. These people had given him everything, and he wasn't going to let them pay for his presence. He stepped into the light. Dwayne saw him first. The Scorpion's leader's eyes lit up with something ugly. Satisfaction, maybe. Or cruelty. "There he is," Dwayne said. "The miracle boy. Come on out here, kid. Let's have a chat." Cashin kept walking. Slow. Deliberate. His hands visible at his sides. Vance turned, his face going pale when he saw Cashin. "Kid, get back inside," Vance ordered, his voice sharp with fear. But Cashin shook his head. "I'm the one you want," Cashin said to Dwayne, his voice steadier than he felt. "Leave them alone. I'll go with you." "No." Garrett's voice came from the doorway behind Vance. "Absolute. Final. You're not going anywhere with these jackals." Dwayne laughed. "Jackals? That's rich coming from you. Look, we don't want trouble. We just want the kid. You hand him over, we leave. Simple." Cashin took another step forward. But before he could speak, the rumble of engines cut through the night. Distant at first, then growing louder. Closer. A dozen motorcycles. Then 2 dozen. The sound rolling across the desert like thunder. Theron had gotten word. Someone from the clubhouse must have gotten through to one of the brothers on the ride. And they turned around. Called in reinforcements from neighboring charters. And now they were coming. The headlights appeared on the horizon. A wall of them, cutting through the darkness like a cavalry charge. Dwayne's smile disappeared. His men shifted nervously, suddenly aware that the numbers had changed dramatically. The bikes rolled into the clubhouse parking lot. Theron was in front, his face a mask of controlled fury. He killed his engine, climbed off, and walked straight toward Dwayne without a word to anyone else. The other bikers fanned out behind him. 40 men, all wearing the red and white, all standing together. If you believe standing up for family is worth any risk, comment family is everything. Share this if you know loyalty is earned, not bought. Theron stopped 3 feet from Dwayne. "You got about 10 seconds to explain why you're on my property threatening my family," Theron said, his voice quiet. Dangerous. Dwayne tried to hold his ground. But facing one man was different from facing 40. "We were just..." Theron cut him off. "You were just leaving. And you're never coming back. Because if I see you or any of your boys near my clubhouse, near my daughter, or near that kid again, I won't call a vote." I won't ask permission. I'll handle it myself. You understand me. Dwayne looked at his men. They were already backing toward their bikes. The fight had gone out of them the moment the headlights appeared. He nodded once. A tight, angry movement. We're done here. Good, Theron said. And Dwayne, one more thing. Whoever told you we'd be vulnerable tonight, whoever fed you that information, they're done too. Because I'm going to find out who it was. And when I do, there won't be enough of them left to identify. Dwayne's eyes widened slightly. Just a fraction, but enough to confirm what Theron suspected. There was a rat in the chapter. Dwayne and his men climbed on their bikes and left. The sound of their engines fading into the distance until there was nothing but desert silence. Theron turned to Cashin. The boy was still standing in the middle of the parking lot, his small frame dwarfed by the men around him. What were you thinking? Theron asked. Not angry, just tired. Cashin looked up at him. I couldn't let them hurt you because of me. Theron's expression softened. He walked over and placed his hand on Cashin's shoulder. The same gesture he'd made 3 weeks ago in the park. Kid, we don't throw family to the wolves. Ever. You don't trade yourself to keep us safe. We keep you safe. That's how this works. But there was still a problem. Someone inside the chapter had betrayed them. Theron called church that night. Every patch member gathered in the main room. Cashin was sent to his room, but he could hear the raised voices through the walls. The anger, the disbelief, brothers accusing each other, trust fracturing. And then, after an hour, silence, followed by a single gunshot that made Cashin jump. Not a real gunshot, just someone slamming something heavy. A table maybe, a fist against wood. The next morning, Theron explained what happened. Riker had confessed, broke down in front of everyone, and admitted he'd been feeding information to the Scorpions. The gambling debt, the desperation, the $5,000 he'd been promised. The chapter voted. Unanimous. Riker was out. They'd stripped his patches, taken his cut, told him he had 24 hours to leave Arizona and never come back. It was mercy in its own way. In other clubs, betrayal like that ended differently. Ended permanently. But Vance had argued for exile instead. Said that Cashin's presence had already brought enough violence to their door. They didn't need more blood on their hands. Life went back to normal after that. Or as normal as it could be. Cashin kept going to school. Kept doing his homework at the kitchen table. Kept learning how to rebuild engines and throw punches and be part of something bigger than himself. Brielle kept visiting. Kept discovering new sounds. Kept holding Cashin's hand and telling him he saved her life. The Brotherhood grew tighter, more protective. The betrayal had hurt, but it had also reminded them why they did this. Why they rode together. Why they claimed lost souls and turned them into family. 6 months later, Cashin stood in the clubhouse common room wearing his own vest. Not a full patch. He was still too young for that. But a prospect cut, with his road name stitched across the back. Cashin Miracle Right. The brothers had voted on it. Unanimous again. Right because that's the last name Theron had given him when he enrolled him in school. Miracle because that's what he'd given Brielle. And Cashin because that's who he'd always been. A kid who saw what others missed. Who helped when he could. Who risked everything to do what was right. Brielle was there for the ceremony. 10 years old now. Talking nonstop. Singing songs she'd learned in school. Laughing at jokes she could finally hear the punchlines to. She hugged Cashin so tight he thought his ribs might crack. You're my brother now, she said. For real. Forever. Cashin smiled. The kind of smile that reached his eyes. That came from somewhere deep and genuine. Forever, he agreed. Theron stood behind them, his hand on both their shoulders. His daughter could hear. His son, because that's what Cashin had become, had a future. And the Brotherhood was whole again. Stronger than before. Because they'd chosen family over fear. Mercy over revenge. And love over everything else. Years later, Cashin would become a full patch member. Would ride beside Thero. But Cashin's fingers were steady. He tilted Brielle's head just slightly, angling it to catch the afternoon sunlight. And there it was. The dark mass visible now that he was close enough. Hardened wax and debris compacted over years. Lodged deep against her eardrum like a cork in a bottle. Cashin's index finger and thumb moved into position. Slow. Careful. His touch was feather-light as he made contact with the obstruction. Brielle's eyes widened slightly at the sensation. Foreign. Strange. But not painful. Theron's breathing stopped entirely. His grip tightened again on Cashin's wrist. Knuckles white. ready to yank the boy back at the first sign of distress from his daughter. Cassian began to pull. Not roughly, not quickly, just steady, gentle pressure, easing the mass free from where it had been wedged for who knows how long. Seconds stretched into eternity. The obstruction resisted at first, held in place by years of compression. Cassian adjusted his angle slightly, his young face a mask of concentration, his bottom lip caught between his teeth. And then it moved. The thick, compact mass began to slide free, millimeter by millimeter, drawn out by Cassian's careful extraction. It was larger than Theron expected, darker, coated in old wax and debris that had accumulated and hardened into something that looked almost solid. Cassian held it in his fingers for just a moment. Proof. Evidence. The answer to 9 years of medical failures. And then it fell away. Silence. A beat of absolute nothing. Brielle stood completely still, her eyes unfocused, her expression frozen somewhere between confusion and fear. Something had changed. Something fundamental. Something she couldn't yet name. And then her breath hitched. A sharp, sudden intake of air that had nothing to do with breathing and everything to do with shock. Her eyes widened, pupils dilating, her entire body going rigid with the overwhelming sensation of sound flooding into her consciousness for the first time in her life. The breeze rustled through the oak trees at the edge of the park, leaves whispering secrets she'd never heard before. Children laughed on the far side of the playground, their voices carrying across the open space like bells. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, sharp and clear and real. Theron exhaled sharply, a sound of tension and disbelief and desperate hope all mixed together. And Brielle heard it. Her hands flew to her ears, both of them, as if trying to confirm that the sensation was real. Her lips trembled, her chin quivered, tears spilled down her cheeks. Hot and fast and unstoppable, she looked up at her father, this man she'd known her entire life but had never truly heard. And her voice came out cracked and broken and more beautiful than any sound Theron had ever heard in his life. "Daddy," she whispered, the words shaped by memory but heard for the very first time. "I hear you." Theron Ironside Hale had been in bar fights that left men unconscious. He'd ridden through thunderstorms that turned highways into rivers. He'd buried brothers who died too young and stood at gravesides without shedding a tear, because that's what being strong meant in his world. But hearing his daughter say "I hear you" for the first time in her life, that broke him completely. His knees went weak. Actually weak. The toughest man in Arizona felt his legs tremble beneath him, felt the ground shift like he'd been hit with something he couldn't fight back against. He released Cassian's wrist, forgot he was even holding it, and dropped into a crouch in front of Brielle, his hands reaching for her face, needing to see her eyes, needing to confirm this was real. Brielle's hands were still pressed against her ears, fingers trembling, her entire body vibrating with the overwhelming sensation of a world that had suddenly become alive with sound. Every rustle, every breath, every footstep on gravel in the parking lot. "Daddy," she said again, and this time she heard herself say it, her own voice. The sound shocked her so much she gasped, which made another sound, which made her gasp again. She started crying, not from pain or fear, but from the sheer magnitude of everything flooding into her consciousness at once. "I can hear," she whispered, testing the words, hearing them vibrate in her throat and emerge into the air as something real, something she could perceive. "Daddy, I can hear. I can hear me. I can hear you. I can hear everything." Her voice rose with each word, climbing from whisper to speaking volume, as if she needed to test the full range of what sound meant. And Theron, this hardened man who'd spent decades building walls around his emotions, felt every single one of those walls crumble into dust. Tears poured down his face. Not quiet tears, not dignified ones, but the kind that come from somewhere deep in the chest, from a place that holds 9 years of helplessness and frustration and watching your child struggle with something you couldn't fix no matter how hard you tried. He pulled Brielle into his arms and held her so tight it probably hurt. But she didn't complain. She pressed her ear against his chest and listened to his heartbeat. Actually heard it for the first time in her life. "The leaves," she said, her voice muffled against his leather vest. "Daddy, the leaves are making noise. And the wind. And that dog. Is that a dog?" Theron couldn't speak. His throat had closed completely. All he could do was nod and hold her and cry in a way he hadn't cried since he was a child himself. And then he remembered Cassian. Theron looked up, his vision blurred with tears, and found the boy standing a few feet away. Cashin had backed up after the extraction, giving them space, his bare feet shifting nervously on the dusty ground. His face carried an expression Theron had seen before on the faces of combat veterans. The look of someone who'd just done something impossible and couldn't quite process it themselves. 9 years, $60,000. 23 specialists with impressive degrees and expensive equipment and access to the latest medical technology. And a barefoot 14-year-old boy did what none of them could. Theron stood slowly, still holding Brielle against his chest with one arm. He looked at Cashin, really looked at him, seeing not just a homeless kid, but someone who'd just fundamentally altered the course of his daughter's entire life. When Theron finally spoke, his voice shook in a way none of his brothers had ever heard. Not from anger, not from intimidation, but from gratitude so profound it changed the texture of every word. "Kid," Theron breathed, barely getting the word out. "You just changed my little girl's life." Cashin shrugged slightly, almost apologetically, his eyes dropping to the ground. "I just wanted to help," he said quietly. The afternoon sun was getting lower now, casting long shadows across the park. A breeze picked up, rustling the leaves again, and Brielle gasped at the sound, pressing closer to her father's chest to hear his heartbeat more clearly. Theron wiped his face with the back of his hand, smearing tears across weathered skin. And in that moment, looking at this skinny, barefoot boy who'd given him a miracle, Theron made a decision that would change 3 lives forever. Theron didn't think. There was no internal debate, no weighing of options or consideration of consequences. Some decisions bypass the mind entirely and come straight from somewhere deeper. From the gut, from the heart, from whatever part of a person recognizes truth when it stands in front of them. This was one of those decisions. Theron looked at Cashin, this child who'd spent 3 years surviving alone, who'd approached a stranger's daughter despite every instinct telling him to stay invisible, who'd risked everything to help someone he didn't know, and saw something he recognized. He saw someone worth protecting. Theron's hands moved to his shoulders, fingers finding the worn leather of his Hell's Angels vest. The cut, as they called it. The sacred garment that represented everything he was. Everything he had earned over 3 decades of loyalty and brotherhood. It was warm from the Arizona sun, heavy with the weight of patches and pins and memories stitched into every inch of leather. The Death Head logo centered on the back. The top rocker reading Hell's Angels. The bottom rocker reading Arizona. The rectangular MC patch below the wing. The vice president patch on the front. Every piece of it representing years of proving himself, of earning his place, of becoming someone who mattered in a world that had tried to tell him he didn't. He lifted it off. The movement was slow, deliberate, ceremonial, like removing a crown to place it on another's head. Cashin watched with wide eyes, not understanding what was happening, his body tensing as if preparing to run. Theron stepped forward, closing the distance between them in 2 strides. And then he draped the vest over Cashin's small shoulders. The leather swallowed the boy. It hung past his waist, the armholes gaping, the bottom hem nearly reaching his knees. Cashin stood there frozen, his thin frame barely filling a quarter of the space that Theron's broad shoulders had occupied moments before. But the weight of it, the actual physical weight of leather and history and belonging, settled onto Cashin's shoulders like an anchor, like something solid in a world that had been weightless and uncertain for too long. "You're not alone anymore," Theron said, his voice rough but steady now. Each word carefully placed like stones building a foundation. "You stay with us now." Cashin's lips parted, but no sound came out. His eyes went glassy with tears he was trying desperately not to shed. His hands came up slowly, fingers touching the leather as if it might disappear if he moved too quickly. "I don't," Cashin started, his voice cracking. "I can't. I'm nobody. I'm just." "You're my daughter's miracle," Theron interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "That makes you family. And family doesn't sleep on park benches. Family doesn't go hungry. Family doesn't survive. Family lives. You understand me?" Cashin nodded, though his face suggested he didn't quite believe what was happening. Kids who'd been abandoned learned not to trust good things. Learned that kindness usually came with conditions. With expectations, with expiration dates. But there was something in Theron's eyes, something unshakable and absolute that cut through Cashin's defenses like a blade through paper. Lucy pulled away from her father just enough to look at Cashin. her face still wet with tears, but lit up with joy that made her look like she was glowing from the inside. "You're staying?" she asked, her voice full of wonder and hope, testing this new ability to hear her own questions. Cashin looked down at her, then back at Theron, then down at the vest drowning his small frame. "I'm staying," he whispered, and saying it out loud made it feel real in a way nothing had felt real in 3 years. Theron placed his hand on top of Cashin's head, the gesture somewhere between a blessing and a claim. This boy was his now, his responsibility, his family. "We'll get you cleaned up," Theron said, his mind already moving through logistics. Through what Cashin would need. Food, clothes, a bed, school enrollment, medical care, everything a child should have had all along. Get you fed, get you home. Home. Cashin had forgotten what that word meant. If you believe this boy deserves everything after what he just did, comment Cashin is a hero. If you think kids like him should never be homeless, share this story. Make some noise for the invisible children. But Theron wasn't the only one who'd have a say in Cashin's future. When the rest of the Brotherhood heard what happened, something unprecedented occurred. Word traveled fast in the Hells Angels. Theron made one phone call from the park. Just one. To his president, a man named Vance, who'd ridden beside him for 18 years. Theron's voice was still shaking when he explained what had happened. What Cashin had done. What he'd decided. "Bring everyone to the clubhouse," Theron said. "I need the brothers to meet someone." Within an hour, motorcycles began rolling into the parking lot of the Hells Angels clubhouse on the east side of Prescott Valley. The rumble of engines announced each arrival. Deep, throaty roars that vibrated through the walls and rattled the windows. One bike, then 3, then 7, then a dozen. Men climbed off their machines, pulling helmets free, their leather cuts bearing the same red and white patches that Theron wore. These were men society had labeled as dangerous, as outlaws, as people to be feared and avoided. And they were all gathering to meet a 14-year-old homeless boy. Cashin stood in the corner of the clubhouse common room, still wearing Theron's oversized vest, trying to make himself as small and invisible as possible. Brielle sat beside him on a worn couch, her hand clasped in his, refusing to let go. She kept tilting her head in different directions, discovering new sounds. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of floorboards, the distant traffic outside. The bikers filed in, their boots heavy on concrete floors. Massive men with scarred knuckles and weathered faces. Men who'd seen violence and survived it. Men who trusted no one outside their brotherhood. They looked at Cashin with expressions that made the boy's stomach clench with fear. But then Theron told them the story. He stood in the center of the room, Brielle on his hip now, and explained everything. The 9 years of silence. The failed doctors. The park. Cashin's observation. The extraction. Brielle's first words after hearing sound. "This kid," Theron said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, "gave my daughter something I couldn't buy. Something specialists with fancy degrees couldn't provide. He gave her the world." The room fell silent.